What's going on, it's Suk and I'm back with a brand new video on SuperDuprTech, and in today's video I'll be showing you the performance differences between the iPhone 15 Pro Max and the brand new iPhone 16 Pro Max. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and without any further ado, let's hit the titles. So first and foremost, I do want to quickly mention that the iPhone 15 Pro Max has the A17 Pro chip, which has a 6-core CPU which has 2 performance and 4 efficiency cores. It's also got a 6-core GPU along with a 16-core neural engine. And things are almost identical with the A18 Pro chip found in the 16 Pro Max, with it too having a 6-core CPU with 2 performance and 4 efficiency cores, along with a 6-core GPU and a 16-core neural engine. But don't be fooled, as the CPU, GPU and the neural engine all have complete redesigns, and so we should see some vast performance increases compared to the outgoing model. So the first series of benchmarking tests which I ran across these two devices was Geekbench 6. Now I started off with the CPU test, and when running this with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, I got a single core score of 2,906 with a multi-core score of 6,588, which compares to the single core score of 3,258 and multi-core score of 7,968 that I got with the 16 Pro Max, which equates to around a 11% difference on the single core side of things and around an 18% difference on the multi-core. So there certainly have been some improvements with the CPU over the outgoing 15 Pro Max. I also wanted to test how well the updated 6-core GPU performs in the A18 Pro, so I then ran the Geekbench 6 Metal Compute test, and when compared to the A17 Pro, it's around 15% faster. The next tests that I ran were designed to test the machine learning aspects of the A18 Pro, which includes the neural engine. So I started off by testing the updated CPU, and when compared to the A17 Pro found in the iPhone 15 Pro Max, it was around 7% faster, with the 16 Pro Max scoring 6,016, whereas the 15 Pro Max scored 5,607. I also tested the machine learning capabilities using the updated GPU, and I found that the GPU in the new 16 Pro Max was around 15% more capable compared to the GPU found in the iPhone 15 Pro Max. The next test that I ran was designed to test the performance of the updated 16-core neural engine. And when compared to the results that I got with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, the neural engine in the 16 Pro Max is around 30% faster. I wanted to further test the performance of the updated 6-core GPU found in the new iPhone 16 Pro Max, so I ran a GFX Bench Metal. Now GFX Bench runs a number of different tests which vary from both higher and lower levels of intensity that I ran both on and off screen. So when we look at the higher level graphically intense tasks, we find that the iPhone 16 Pro Max is around 30% more capable, and when comparing the lower level intense tasks, we can see that there's around a 25% increase in performance. I also ran the benchmark GPU test, running the official native test at medium settings, which is ran at the resolution of 2778 by 1284. And with this test, we see a difference of above 60% between these two devices, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max scoring 93 frames per second. In comparison, the iPhone 16 Pro Max averaged 177.48 frames per second. When running the benchmark GPU test at full HD, that's 1920 by 1080, we find that there's around a 54% difference between these two devices, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max averaging 137 frames per second compared to the 240 frames per second averaged by the 16 Pro Max. Further wanting to test the 6-core GPU across these two devices, I ran a number of different tests from 3D Mark, starting off with the wildlife test. Now with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, we see it averaging 45 frames per second compared to the almost 60 frames per second that we see with the 16 Pro Max. I also ran the wildlife stress test. Now with the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the lowest score that it got was 8,982. Conversely, the highest score that the 15 Pro Max was able to score was 7,685. So even when the iPhone 16 Pro Max is performing at its weakest, it's still more capable than the outgoing model. I also ran the wildlife extreme test, and between these two devices across the board, whether it's the score or the frame rate, we see around a 27% increase in performance on the 16 Pro Max. I also ran the wildlife extreme stress test, and when running this test we can see that the best loop that the iPhone 15 Pro Max scored was 2,353, whereas the worst score of the 16 Pro Max was 2,663. So once again, not only can we see this performance increase between these two models, but we can also see that difference between the cooling, as the iPhone 15 Pro Max has a copper film within it, whereas the 16 Pro Max has a graphene sheet within it to help dissipate the heat. I also wanted to test the ray tracing capabilities of these two smartphones, so I ran the Solar Bay test. Now the iPhone 15 Pro Max scored 4,412, whereas the iPhone 16 Pro Max scored 6,226. which equates to around a 34% difference, and we see that same kind of difference translate to the average frame rate, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max averaging 16.8 frames per second compared to the 23.7 frames per second in the iPhone 16 Pro Max. And to stress the ray tracing capabilities of these devices, I ran the Solar Bay stress test, and once again we can clearly see that the best performance of the iPhone 15 Pro Max is still not even equal to the worst performance of the iPhone 16 Pro Max, with the best loop of the 15 Pro Max scoring 4,099 compared to the worst loop of the 16 Pro Max being 4,824. I also ran the Steel Nomad light test, and when running this test we see around a 30% performance difference between these two devices. I then ran the Steel Nomad light stress test. Now the best score that we got with the iPhone 15 Pro Max was 1010, whereas the worst score that we got with the 16 Pro Max was 1166. So once again we can clearly see a massive performance difference between these two devices. I then ran a Wi-Fi network speed test, and you can see that both of these devices performed pretty much identically, with the 15 Pro Max coming in with a download speed of 550 megabits per second compared to 564 megabits per second with the 16 Pro Max. I also wanted to test if there were any differences between the cellular connections between these two devices, and what I noticed is the 15 Pro Max had upload speeds around 50% that of the 16 Pro Max. Now I'm not sure if this has anything to do with any updated antennas or the differences in modems, but I can certainly tell you that there was a difference every single time that I tested it between the upload speeds on the cellular connection between these devices. I then ran the Antutu benchmark, which tests the CPU, GPU, the system memory along with the storage on these devices. Now the iPhone 15 Pro Max scored 1,053,421 compared to the 1,552,405 of the iPhone 16 Pro Max. And within this test we see the bulk of the increases coming from the CPU and GPU. I then wanted to test the storage of these two devices. Now it is worth noting that the iPhone 15 Pro Max that I have here has 512 gigabytes of storage when compared to the 256 gigabytes of the entry 16 Pro Max. Nevertheless, the sequential write and read speeds that I got with the iPhone 16 Pro Max were substantially lower than what I've got with the 15 Pro Max. Now I'm unsure whether this has anything to do with this specific test or if it's anything to do with the amount of storage that these two devices have. I then ran the Antutu HTML browser benchmark, and on the iPhone 15 Pro Max I got a score of 71,785, whereas the iPhone 16 Pro Max scored 86,543. I then ran the Jazz Disk benchmark to test the storage once again on these two devices. Now on the read side of things, both of these devices were identical, with them both reading at a speed of 1,651.61 megabytes per second, whereas on the write side of things we see the iPhone 15 Pro Max writing a little slower, with it clocking a speed of 853.33 megabytes per second compared to the 1,422.22 megabytes per second on the 16 Pro Max. So there you have it. When it comes to these two devices, there are some substantial increases, especially around that neural engine, and we do see that graphically the iPhone 16 Pro Max is quite superior than the outgoing 15 Pro Max. On the CPU side, we see differences of around 10 to 20% at times, but in overall, the differences aren't as big as what we see with the GPU and the neural engine. Overall, I think it's still a solid improvement, but does it warrant an upgrade? Probably not. And if you have got a 10s, 11, 12 or even a 13 Pro, then it may warrant an upgrade at this current stage. Or even some of the iPhone 14 models, especially as these devices will not get Apple Intelligence. But hey, that has been it for today's video. Of course, if you enjoyed the video and found out anything useful, then be sure to smack that like button, and if you are new around here, then be sure to subscribe, clicking the bell icon to be notified when I upload any of my up and coming videos. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care and have a good one.